Hello, Trinity family. We sure do miss you. We miss being able to gather together. I do hope you're taking advantage of the live streaming services that we've been able to have. We had this past Sunday, both a morning worship service, but an evening time where we had a prayer time. And what was really neat in doing that evening time with folks on Facebook Live is that they could share their prayer requests just by typing in the comments section on Facebook. And so we were able to take those off and to pray for those requests. So please take advantage of that. If you're watching this video, you certainly have the technology to be able to be involved in our live streaming services. Well, as you know, the pastoral staff is doing videos, and Pastor has done videos in a way of encouraging us. Pastor Randy has similarly been doing videos on encouragement, but focusing on discipleship and discipleship principles. And then I have been dealing with the topic of family and biblical principles for raising your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so this is a continuation of that first video. So this was part 2. There will be a part 3 to come. But in way of review, I mentioned last time that our overall goal for our children should be that they grow in their love for the Lord and their desire to serve the Lord, and grow in their obedience and submission to the Lordship of Christ. And then, of course, learning to love others, as God's word says that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, our soul, and our strength, and then to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so I began in that list video to speak of some of the components of that, and the first one being to seek to bring your children to genuine conversion in Christ. And so I want to continue with that. And the second component then being to help your children grow in godliness. And that, of course, is a lifelong process. But our goal is to get our kids to have a Godward focus in their life. And so we should teach them that they're ultimately accountable to God. And they must learn that their disobedience and sin displeases Him. They need to learn to please God with every thought and word and action. And as soon as they're old enough, we want to help them to develop their own private time with the Lord, their devotional time with God, if you will. That begins by dads having a family devotion time with the whole family, and then teaching their children how to spend their own time, their personal time with the Lord. Another important part in helping children grow in godliness is to find ways to help them to develop a biblical discernment, that they're able to evaluate things and to determine whether those things are things that would be pleasing to God. One of the things that Dana and I tried to do with our children when they were very young is to get themselves to ask very important questions. Questions like, in doing this, am I doing this in obedience to God? And the other question being, does this activity or does this action or attitude please God? Part of growing in godliness is also developing godly character qualities. Hebrews 12 and verse 10 says that God disciplines or trains us so that we may share in His holiness. So we must train our children to share in God's holiness, and that begins by teaching them who God is. And we should emphasize the holiness of God as His primary attribute. We should teach them about moral purity and how to deal with sin in their own life. And we ought to also help them to understand that their attitudes are important, not just their behavior. It's easy for us as parents to really focus on the outward behavior because it's outward, it's in our face, we can see it. But we also need to help them with their attitudes, as the attitudes are probably even more important, as from our attitudes flows our behavior. Proverbs 22:15 says that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him. Thinking about that verse, it's important for us to understand the doctrine of sin and to take that seriously. This means that our children, of course, by nature, are totally depraved. They're sinful. They're self-centered. And since as sinners, we're all rebellious at heart, kids need to learn submission to proper authority as part of that growing in godliness. The third component to this would be to help your children cultivate godly relationships. Practicing that second great commandment to love our neighbor as we do in fact love ourselves really would begin in the home. Our kids need to learn what biblical love means and how it's demonstrated. They need to learn how to resolve conflicts God's way as opposed to their own way or the world's way. They need to learn how to speak in a manner that builds up rather than tears others down. And they need to learn how to be discerning in choosing friends and to not choose friends that would drag them into sin and worldliness, but to actually choose friends that would encourage them in their spiritual life and that they could encourage as well. They need to learn how to minister to others, to their parents, to other adults, and to their peers as well. And part of that would also be teaching them the importance of sharing the gospel with others, evangelism, and even having a part in discipling others as well. The fourth component would be to train your children in life's responsibilities. Kids need to learn skills to be able to function later on as adults. And I think this would include teaching them domestic duties. I think we ought to make sure at a very early age that they understand that they're part of a family, and each part of a family must do their part to contribute to the health of the family. They should learn to take care of and respect the possessions and property that God has given to them and to respect the property of others. They also need to learn how to manage their time as to be responsible in completing their duties and their schoolwork and their chores. And part of that would also be teaching them to learn how to balance work and leisure time. Give it to themselves. Our children would much rather play and neglect the responsibilities. But it's important to teach them that work should be done first. So these are goals under that overall goal of helping our kids grow in their love for God and their love for others as they grow in submission to the Lordship of Christ. But how do we get there? How do we accomplish that? And we certainly can't cover all of that in the short time that we have here. But let me give you a few biblical thoughts about that and a few biblical methods. And the first one being this: as God relates to us, so must we relate to our children. That statement is not unique to me. I learned that statement as I've looked into this issue of how to relate to your children. I thought, wow, that is really good. There's really some important principles that we can get out of that idea to, as God relates to us, we should relate to our children. Does God love us in spite of our many shortcomings and sins? Well, of course. And so we should love our children and not withdraw our love as a means of punishment. Does God patiently correct us for our good so that we may share in his holiness? Then we should do the same for our children. And so let me emphasize eventually three things in regard to that. Actually getting to just the first point today, and then we'll continue on with that in my next video. But the first thing to emphasize in regard to that would be to understand that your example as a parent is all important. It is very important in training your children. Your kids will learn more from your life than they will from your lectures, especially if your lectures don't back up your life. And that is not to say that we don't speak truth to our children and guide them through our words. but it's just to emphasize the fact that our example will communicate more. Ephesians 5 and verse 1 tells us to be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us. You know, if your kids see you loving God with all your heart and having his word on your heart continually, they're more likely to catch that same love. Very important passage in dealing with the responsibilities that we have as parents is found in the Old Testament. And the principles are true in the New Testament, but all the way back in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 to 9, it says this: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." Parents, and especially dads, that is intentional discipleship. Are you doing that? That is what God has instructed us to do. And not only must you model loving God, but you must also model loving others. Especially important is that you show consistent, faithful love and respect for each member of the family. Dads, showing great respect for your children's mother, your wife, and the same is true for moms, to show respect for your children's dad. In cases of divorce, very tricky, so that you respect your children's father or mother, even if you're apart. And what gets tricky about that sometimes is for a godly Christian parent whose former spouse is not living in a godly way. That's a struggle. There may be times when you have to show your children that the lifestyle of their other parent is not biblical, but still teaching them to respect and to love that parent is certainly an important thing. You know, we are not going to be perfect as parents. None of us are. And so what I'm saying here today doesn't imply perfection, but it does imply living in the reality of our own submission and obedience to God, and recognizing our own sin and humbly confessing our sin and seeking forgiveness when we're wrong. And what's even perhaps more difficult is recognizing when we sin against our children and going to them and being honest about that and seeking their forgiveness. So in review, we want to help our children to grow in their love for God, in their obedience and submission to God, and in their love for others. And we want to seek to bring them to genuine conversion and help them to grow in godliness and holiness. Also to help them to cultivate godly relationships and to relate to our children as God relates to us. And certainly understanding that our example in these matters is all important. I hope these ideas and these principles have been helpful to you, and I will continue them the next time I present a video to you. Be well, and again, be as much in contact with one another through means like this as you possibly can, and hope to see you in our live stream on Sunday.